So let's look at what scoping means in JavaScript. Scope basically refers to all of the context in which we can have access to a variable within a code or a program. There are also two types of code in JavaScript. We have the global scope and the local scope. To further understand this concept, let's look at an example. So I've defined a variable species, assigned it to the value human, and defined a function here. The function is transform. We've defined the a variable species, assigned it to a different value, werewolf, and we're returning species. Then we are logging species and we're also logging the function. Now, can you take a guess what this would return before mine actually runs? Did you get it right? So on line 30, when we log species, we are getting human, and when we log transform, we're getting werewolf. So why does this happen? Now, the global scope refers to all of the variables that are globally accessible within the code, right? And you will typically identify a variable that is in the global scope by the fact that it is not within a block. Now, a local scope, a variable that has a local scope is always within a block code. And we know the block code is any code that starts and ends with a curly brace. The if statement, this function statement is a local scope, right? Any function, any variable that is not within the confines of a block is a global scope, and any variable that is within the confines of a block scope is a as a local scope. And so we have access to, even within a function, we have access to everything in the global scope, but outside of the function, we don't have the global scope does not have access to the variables within the local scope. I hope that wasn't too confusing. So when we log species, the species being logged is going to consider the one on the global scope. It does not have access to the one within this local scope, within this block. So it cannot log this. If we comment this out, if we comment the first species, so that means there is nothing like species in the global scope, and we run this, we are going to get a reference error, that is species is not defined. And species is not defined because there is nothing like species in the global scope. We only have species locally, and we don't have access to that. Only when we call this function can we have access to this species. But outside of this function, we cannot have access to this variable. Therefore, it has a local scope. Now, if we comment this species within the function out, and we uncomment the species outside of the function, if we run our code again, we can see that we have both humans now. Now, this tells us that transform, this function, is calling or is reading the species outside of its block. So if we don't have any species similar names, it's going to pick the one outside of its block. But if it has similar name, it's going to pick the one inside of its block. So because it had species here, it's read werewolf. But now that we comment species out, it's going to read the variables that are outside of its block. This is how local scoping and global scoping works in JavaScript.